So welcome everybody to today's employer learning session as part of Project Learning Tree Canada's Green Jobs Are For Everyone workshop series. My name is Zach Wagman and I'm PLT Canada's Senior Green Jobs Manager. During today's employer learning session, we'll explore how to create safe, supportive, and empowering green job spaces for newcomer youth. I'd now like to introduce our presenter for today, Sienna J. Taylor. As a project manager at Immploy, Sienna works with an incredible team of people to provide programs and services that connect immigrants and refugees with mentorship and employment in Southwestern Ontario. Sienna is also leading the launch of a new employer engagement initiative that focuses on supporting employers and recruitment and retention of newcomers, including education and training based on equity and inclusion. And with that, I'll pass things over to you, Sienna.
Thanks so much for the introduction. So I will pull up my screen here. What we're going to be talking about today is engaging newcomer youth and some best practices for hiring talented newcomer youth in the green sector. So what I want to explore in this session today is a little bit of context. Why does it even matter to engage newcomer youth? Why does it matter across the country? And then why does it matter in your workplaces? So we have a good understanding and are in the same place. And then we'll kind of go over some best practices in terms of how you can actually recruit and retain those folks. So a little bit about where I'm coming from. So I am from London, Ontario, and work for an organization called Immploy. And as you heard from Zach, Immploy connects employers with immigrant talent to foster economic prosperity. We do this by supporting employers in recruiting and retaining immigrant talent, bridging the gap between labor market demand and supply, strengthening sustainability and recognition with an employer-led council. So what that means is that we are actually guided by a council of regional employers and becoming a regional champion for immigrant talent. The three main programs that we facilitate are listed here. So the first one is job match recruitment services. So we provide shortlisting, screening, and recommendations of newcomers for employers who are hiring. We have our employer engagement and education project, which Zach mentioned briefly, which provides one-on-one consultation with employers to understand their needs. We develop customized education and training rooted in equity and inclusion. And then we provide workplace integration supports, which means that we provide ongoing coaching and one-on-one support for employers as they're navigating changes in their workplace and engaging newcomers. And then one of the most important programs that we run is our newcomer mentorship program, where we match newcomers up with leaders in the community who are working in the same field as them. And they provide support to them around their job search, resumes, interviewing, all the stuff, involved in that journey. But they also provide support around, what is it like to work within their industry in the Canadian context? So, why does immigration matter? So when we talk about engaging newcomers, there's an inherent assumption that we know why it matters. And of course, there's the ethical and moral argument around it, but there's also a business case around engaging newcomers. So some information about immigration across Canada. So by the year 2035, 25% of Canada's population will actually be over the age of 65. And there are 5 million Canadians set to retire by that year. Currently, our worker to retiree ratio is 4 to 1, but in 2035, that will shift to 2 to 1. So what that basically means is that a big chunk of our workforce will be aging out. So we're going to be experiencing this sort of mass exodus of baby boomers from the workforce. On top of that, Canadians' birth rate is declining annually. So what that means is that Canadian-born families are not having enough babies to replace the workforce across the economy. So we are becoming more and more reliant on newcomers, on immigrants and refugees and international students to fill the shortages in the labor market. So it's very, very important that we consider engaging newcomers at all ages. In terms of what newcomers bring to the Canadian economy, so First, immigrants contribute to an educated Canada. So in 2019, close to 60% of recent immigrants and about 50% of immigrants working in Canada had a university degree. Immigrants are very politically engaged. Donors from immigrant families are very generous and very philanthropic in the nonprofit sector. And so we know that there are a lot of benefits to engaging newcomers in our communities. When you think about your workplace specifically, we know that diversity in the workplace is extremely beneficial. So by 2032, based on the stats that you've already seen, about 25% of Canada's population will have been born in another country. Studies have also shown that with a 1% increase in ethnocultural diversity, we see 2.5% increase in revenue and 0.5% increase in productivity in the workplace. So we know that when we're bringing newcomers into the workplace and we're increasing the diversity of our workplace, we perform better in whatever it is that we're doing. So when you consider the work that's happening in the green sector and you consider the amount of innovation that we're looking for, newcomers bring that insight with them. We also know from a number of studies that 47% of millennials consider diversity to be a key factor in choosing an employer. So we know that folks that are intentionally seeking employment in the green sector are going to likely see this as an even higher priority than in other sectors. We also know that non-white applicants throughout Canada are less likely to get callbacks despite their qualifications. So despite knowing all this, despite knowing that our country is dependent on newcomers, we know that newcomers bring a lot of success, but yet there are still barriers that a lot of newcomers, especially racialized newcomers, are facing when they're looking for positions in the workforce. When we think about, on top of some of those stats that I just shared, when we think about why we would want to engage newcomer youth in the workplace, there have been a number of different organizations that have looked at the benefits. And so here are some of the top 10. So one, like I mentioned, there's higher innovation. So when we're looking for creative solutions to problems, we know that diversity contributes to that hugely. There's a variety of different perspectives and a lot of times global perspective. Increased creativity, much faster problem solving, better decision making, increased profits where if you are working in an organization where you've got a social enterprise or you are looking at revenue streams, we know that this is increased there. Reduced employee turnover, higher employee engagement, better company reputation, and improved hiring results. So when we think about newcomer youth, a lot of times what we're talking about is international students. So Canada is the world's third leading destination for international students. So there are a lot of folks from around the world that choose Canada as a place to come to for their studies, whether it's in elementary, secondary, or post-secondary school. An interesting fact, Ontario, for those of you that are in Ontario, Ontario accounts for close to 50% of the international student population. We also know that about 60, and some sources say 80%, so somewhere between 60 and 80% of international students have communicated an interest in becoming permanent residents following their studies. One of the biggest concerns that we hear from employers in engaging young newcomers is, especially if they are international students, is that they're not sure if they'll be sticking around. But we know from the studies that have been done that these folks are looking for pathways to stay in Canada. We also know that international students contribute approximately $22 billion to the country's economy, and they sustain over 170,000 jobs. So there are a lot of benefits to engaging international students. So the question begs, if we have so much young talent, why do our provinces continue to experience such high rates of job vacancies? So before I jump into some of the details around this, I want to share a cheesy little story that I like to share when I'm doing sessions with folks. You may have heard this before, but if not, hopefully it provides a little bit of insight to you. So the story goes like this. There's a woman who is attending her family's Thanksgiving dinner, and she's in the kitchen and she notices that her mom cuts off both ends of the ham before putting it into a roasting pan. And so she asks her mom, why do you cut off both ends of the ham? And her mom says, I'm not sure. That's how your grandmother did it. Why don't you ask her? So the mom goes to the grandmother and she says, Grandma, I noticed that mom cut off both ends of the ham before putting it in the pan. She says she did it because that's what you did. why do you do that? And she said, oh, I'm not sure. My mom did it that way. Why don't you ask her? So she goes to ask her great grandmother, why do you cut off both ends of the ham? And her grandmother says, well, my roasting pan was too small. And so the reason I like to share that is because I think it highlights to us that sometimes we do things just because we've always done them that way. And if we don't ask why we do things the way we do, we might be missing out on really incredible opportunities. So when we look across our country, we see very high job vacancy rates. And there are a number of different reasons for that. Some is the hidden job market, but some of this is because we don't have the right recruitment and retention practices to engage folks that are looking for work. And we know that newcomers and we know that young newcomers face a number of barriers when they're trying to access employment. So what I want to go through now are some best practices so that we as employers can do a better job of opening up, creating opportunities for newcomer youth, and in turn creating more inclusive workspaces. So first thing that we want to start with when we're thinking about engaging newcomers is the job postings themselves. So again, this is one of those things that oftentimes we create job postings the way we've always created them. So I'd encourage you to go back to any of the opportunities that you have within your organizations and reconsider how you create those. So first things first, we want to make sure that the language in any of our job postings is extremely clear and concise. So first, that means very straightforward job titles. So as much as we want to be fun and creative with our job titles, sometimes we see things like community animator and happiness coordinator and data storyteller. That doesn't always tell a newcomer what that job is. We want to consider cultural and language differences and make sure that we're being as clear as we possibly can. In job descriptions, you want to make sure that you're using plain English. So language that we would use in our everyday life. When we consider newcomers, some of them, English may not be their first language. And so we want to make sure that when we are developing job postings, we're developing them in a way that everyone is able to understand what the role and responsibilities are. We want to do our best to avoid cultural references and metaphors. So things like glass half full, that may be something that we take for granted in Canada and that we just understand what these things mean, but a young newcomer person may not understand what that means. We also want to try to avoid technical or industry related jargon. And again, try to stick to that plain language. We also want to make sure that we're focusing on essentials. So don't inflate education or experience. So when you're looking at the opportunities that you have available for young people, focus on the essentials. A lot of times when folks are coming from different countries, the expectations may be different. You may have this massive long list of what your ideal candidate would be, but do you absolutely need every single one of those pieces? So stick to the essentials. Be as specific as you can. So this goes back to the clear and concise language. When you're developing job postings within your sector, you want to make sure that a young newcomer is going to understand exactly what it is that you're looking for. Be accessible. This is super important for any role where you're wanting to engage young people, but especially newcomer youth. You want to make sure that there's a way for them to contact you if they have questions about your organization or about the role. Also consider your equity brand. And so when I say this, I mean that when somebody is looking at your job posting, they should know that an equitable workplace, an inclusive workplace is something that's important to you. If they can't tell in the job description, then there's something that you should be adding there. The other thing that I would recommend is that you intentionally put into your job posting, newcomer applicants welcome, immigrant applicants welcome. So include that specific language so that young newcomers know that this is a job that they can apply to. And finally, when it comes to job postings, I would encourage you to embrace change, but not at the risk of inclusion. A lot of times what we find people doing is that they're trying to be more youthful or more progressive. They're trying to have these cool ways of engaging millennials. But what that often does is it excludes a lot of newcomer folks, especially when we consider those cross-cultural barriers. So there's a delicate balance that you want to keep there. So when it comes to the actual outreach part, so if you're wanting to engage newcomer youth, you have to consider the actual outreach. So oftentimes what we do when we're looking to engage folks is that we just have our, the different platforms that we like to post our job on. But I would encourage you to go beyond that. And one of the first things that I would encourage you to do is consider proactive versus reactive hiring. So what I would encourage you to do is take a look at the roles that you have now in your organization and the ones that you may be hiring for in the future, and plan ahead. Put those job postings together and plan who you're going to engage and reach out to, so that you don't get to a point where all of a sudden you have funding or you have the finances to hire and you're having to do it really, really quickly. Often what happens when employers do reactive hiring is that inclusion takes a back seat. So we want to make sure that we're preparing ahead of time for this. Actually reach out. Oftentimes what we hear from employers is that when they are hiring, they look within their networks. And if we want to be more inclusive and we want to engage newcomer youth, we need to reach beyond. We need to actually do that outreach. Be intentional about widening your search. So when I say this, I mean, not just the reaching out, but how you're doing that outreach. So even though you may have an HR team or a couple of people who are responsible for hiring, consider how other people within your organization or in your community that could support you in that recruitment process. Are there people who are connected to different networks and communities that you could engage in sharing those roles that you have available? Partner with the right organization. So I'll talk a little bit about this coming up, but you want to make sure that you're not just relying on those, those typical platforms like Indeed or Monster or things like that, but actually engage with organizations that make sense. PLT is a great example of an organization you could connect with if you're wanting to widen your search. The other thing that I would encourage you to do is set targets, and I encourage you to, if you haven't already taken some time to understand tokenism, I would encourage you to do this first, and then consider how you can set targets for yourself, not in terms of tokenizing individuals, but holding yourselves accountable in terms of making sure that your recruitment strategy is reflective of the community that you serve. So in terms of who you can engage, so when you think, everybody is coming from different communities. So you have to think about your community and what is available in your community. And just like with the pot roast example, I encourage you to reconsider who you might have connected with in the past and start to really widen that out. So first thing that always comes to mind for me, if you're wanting to engage newcomer youth, is connect with community centers. This is super, super important. Community centers are often hubs for newcomers, and this is a great way to get connected with folks in the community. Another great place similar to community centers are YMCAs or YWCAs. Both of these places are often funded to facilitate programs for newcomers, so they are great resources to plug into. Of course, there are settlement service agencies. One of the things that I will note here, which is a bit of a wild statistic, is that research has shown that 60 to 90% of newcomers don't connect with settlement service agencies at all. So that's why on this list, I include community centers and the YMCAs first, because we want to make sure that we're able to engage folks that may not be plugged into those settlement service agencies. Also consider the multicultural networks or associations that are within your community. These are great places to connect to and send job descriptions. Of course, there's always employment organizations and agencies. I would encourage you to look within your community to see if there are organizations that provide services specifically to newcomers. If you're in the Southwestern Ontario region, Immploy and Will Employment Connections are great examples of that. And then there are also local immigration partnerships in different communities that you can check out as well. One of the most incredible resources that I'm going to just showcase for you here are immigrant employment councils. So Immploy is part of a national IEC group, Immigrant Employment Councils. So these are councils that exist all across the country, from BC all the way over to Newfoundland. So if you are not already connected to the closest IEC to you, I would encourage you to do that. So I'm just going to click on this link here to pull up the IEC BC website. So what you'll notice on the very front page here is I am an employer looking for immigrant talent. They make it very, very easy for you to get connected with newcomer populations and engage those folks as you're hiring or engaging in your company or in your organization. So like I said, the IEC is part of a national group. And so there is an IEC in BC, in Alberta. There are quite a few in Ontario, Newfoundland, Nova Scotia. And so I'll make sure that I send a list of resources to PLT to send out your way so that you can not only get access to the online resources from the IECs, but I'll also be able to provide you with a direct connection to an individual in your area. So you can find out how they can support you in your community. The other resource that I wanted to mention to you is the Newcomer Services across Canada. So the government of Canada offers this great resource that is actually for newcomers to use. I am a big fan of using alternative platforms to engage with different communities. So although this platform is not developed for employers, it is a great resource if you want to get plugged in and connected to newcomers. So just to show you very quickly how you can use this, if we typed in here Alberta, and then we clicked here help finding a job and job specific language training, which are both very relevant, and we click find, you'll see a list of organizations that come up in the province of Alberta that support newcomers on their employment journey. I guarantee you that if, as an employer, if you are looking to connect with newcomer youth, this is a great place to connect with. This is a great way to get connected. You'll see a number of different organizations. Again, you'll see a lot of community-based services. This is a great way to get plugged in. So what I would encourage you to do as you engage, as you're looking to engage with newcomers, like I said, try something different. Don't just post on LinkedIn or post on Indeed or Monster or those sites, but actually engage the communities that you're looking to bring in to your organization. So beyond this, I want to talk a little bit about screening. Job posting is the first step. Doing that recruitment process is the next step. But we also want to make sure that when newcomer youth are coming, when they're applying for jobs, that they're getting a fair chance as you go through that process. So screening is actually a major component. So when I say screening, what I mean is when you get a number of resumes for a position that you're hiring for, how do you actually go through that process? So a couple of suggestions here. One, remove the names from resumes. So there's a lot of organizations that are starting to do this in order to create more equal opportunity. This helps to reduce some of the bias that might come forward from names that you don't recognize. Another great suggestion is to have more than one person reviewing resumes. So I would encourage you to do that as well. So the second best practice is considering your essential versus your non-essential skills. So make sure that you separate your must-haves from the nice-to-have skill sets. So the experience that you know, when we're talking about youth in general, experience is going to look different. But then when you layer in folks that may be coming from a different country, may not have spent as much time in Canada, their experience might look really different. So you want to make sure that you're not trying to capture the absolute perfect, you know, ideal person for this role, but that you're actually asking yourself, what is it that we actually need for this young person coming to our organization, and focus on those things. Evaluating experience. This can be a bit of a tough one. So depending on the type of role that you're looking for, if you are looking for someone who has or is already in a post-secondary institution, we have to recognize that credentials might look different depending on where someone went to school. So we want to make sure that just because someone went to school outside of Canada doesn't necessarily mean that their credentials are not as good. What we often see from employers is that they equate Canadian or North American education as being better, which is not always the case. So we want to try to remember and try to reduce that bias as we're screening resumes. Considering communication skills. So when we look at a candidate's ability to carry out specific communication tasks, we often find people posting very generalized or looking for very generalized things like effective communication. So what we want to consider, because when we talk about newcomer youth, again, we might be looking at a pool of candidates where English is their second language. We want to actually take the time to think about, well, what does good communication actually mean for our organization? And be specific about that, and consider, that people may have very great written English skills. They may have great verbal English skills, and some people may still be in the process of learning the language. But if you don't make assumptions when you're going through that screening process, and allow people the opportunity to come in and interview with you in order to determine if that is something that is going to be a challenge or a barrier. And then we also want to consider time at previous jobs. So one of the things that we know, especially with young people, is that they're often engaged in contract work, short-term work. Maybe it's when they're, over the summers in school. And so if you see short-term work, we want to make sure that we're not excluding folks based on that, but still giving that opportunity. So last but not least, best practices for interviewing. So when we are interviewing young people, when we're interviewing newcomers, we have to consider that there are some cross-cultural considerations as we go into those conversations. So the first thing that I would encourage you to do is communicate expectations. This is important when you're engaging any youth, but especially folks that may be coming from a different culture. So you want to provide specific details such as dress code and any other expectations for the interview of what they should bring or be prepared to speak to ahead of time. So we want someone's ability to sort of read minds or just anticipate exactly what you might need may not be indicative of their ability to actually do the job well. I think for most of us as employers, what we mainly look for, we do want folks who take initiative, but what we're mainly looking for is for people to be able to understand their roles and responsibilities and execute on that. And so even through the interview process, there's absolutely nothing that says that we can't give people some expectations and some understanding of how that process will unfold. You want to try to reduce bias from the interview process. So even with standardized interview questions, if you interact with any candidate differently, for example, if you find you have something in common with someone or there's a personal connection, it can completely change your impression of that candidate. So having a diverse interview panel that reflects the community can really help with that bias, and making sure that you maintain similar questions for every candidate that's coming through. You also may want to consider training your hiring managers or HR staff on cross-cultural awareness. So there are a lot of different organizations that can facilitate intercultural competency training or equity and inclusion training. Immploy is definitely one of those organizations that can do that, but there are also a lot of local organizations all across the country that can provide this kind of support. This is very, very important when you're going through the interview process. Again, you want to make sure that you use plain language. So a really great example of one of our clients was had an interview at an organization. And one of the questions they asked them is, what do you bring to the table? And so their response was, well, I would bring food to the table. And so the employer thought that, maybe that was a bit of a snarky response, or they weren't taking it seriously. But in reality, the person that was the candidate that was in the interview had never heard that kind of question before. They didn't understand that cultural reference. So when you're interviewing, you want to make sure that you're using plain language, and again, just like the job postings, that you're removing some of those metaphors and cultural references and slang and jargon and things like that may not be common to a young person, but especially a young person coming from a different country and a different culture. So be as clear as you possibly can, and make sure that if you get a confusing response from someone, that you clarify and give them the opportunity to really understand what it is that you're looking for and how they can provide the best responses as possible. And of course, this is just something that we always encourage, and I would encourage including this on job postings and throughout any recruitment and retention practice, is making sure that you are giving salary or wage ranges. So when we think about disparities in income across the country, we do know that there are specific groups of people, including newcomers and racialized individuals, who often make less because they don't have the same negotiating power as other folks coming into these meetings. So asking somebody what their expectations are without giving them a heads up or allowing them the chance to understand, what is reasonable or what is common in that industry is a bit unfair. So we want to make sure that we're providing as much information ahead of time. So that is all from me in terms of best practices. So the last thing that I would iterate before we jump into some Q&A for the last 10 minutes is that, again, back to that pot roast story. We want to ask ourselves, why do we do the things that we do? Why do we write our job postings the way that we do? Why do we why does our recruitment practice look the way that it does? And why do we ask the questions we ask in interview questions? So we want to ask ourselves, why do we do this? And if we can't answer, if we don't have a clear answer for why, then likely there's opportunity for us to evolve these processes. Evolve them to be more inclusive. And I guarantee you, with these practices, it will not only open up, not only will it widen the talent pool of young newcomers, but you will engage a whole whack of people that maybe you wouldn't have been able to engage before. So I really see this as an opportunity to expand on what you're already doing and improve on the practices that you have. Because as we all know, the more diverse our workforce is, whether we're thinking about age or we're thinking about diversity in culture, we know that those people are bringing diverse perspectives and insights and innovative ideas, and it will serve not only the organizations that you work for, but the work that we're trying to do in the green sector. It will serve us very, very well. So I will open it up to the floor in case anybody does have any questions.
Thanks, Sienna. That was a really excellent presentation, and I think a lot of great tips and takeaways that employers can easily incorporate into their day-to-day practices. So if you do have any questions, feel free to raise your hand and you can unmute yourself. You can also throw your questions in the chat. But just to start us off, Sienna, I'm curious, what is the most common professions that newcomers typically go into? Are green jobs in the forest sector even on their radar? And if not, what are some ways that the sector as a whole can make these jobs more evident to them?
That is a really great question. So one of the things that we have to consider when we're engaging newcomers is that even job titles, types of jobs, they may not exist in some countries in the way that they do here, and vice versa. And so even when the way that we organize our sectors and talk about work may be different. So when we think about the majority of newcomers that are coming into the country, a lot of this is determined by the federal government. And so I can speak to our client base. About 20% of them are engineers working in all different areas. But folks in the STEM field, so science, tech, engineering, math, there are a lot of newcomers coming to Canada in those fields. And one of the things that we do know is happening is that recruiters will go to other countries to recruit international students will often dictate what programs they take. So a lot of times they're being told, if you go into this field or this field, and the STEM fields being a big one, that you will get express entry into the country. So we do know that in terms of when we consider the green fields or the green sector, that science base, like the science-based education, there definitely is a high number, but whether these folks are understanding, the different sectors, so thinking about, I'm going to work in the green sector, I think that awareness is low. And that's been my experience so far. So one of the things that we're doing, aside from connecting with and working with PLT, is we've gotten connected with our local environmental network to collaborate with them. And so one of the things that we do, and I would encourage all of the employers here to look for opportunities like this, is we invite employers to roundtables, into panels where they can come in and they can talk about the importance of the green sector or whatever their mission focus is, and the different opportunities that are there, the kinds of skills that they're looking for, and any job opportunities that might come up. And so the national IEC group, so the Immigrant Employment Council group, would be a great place to connect with in order to engage and just, and that's also a really great way to take on that proactive hiring approach, is to get connected with these organizations and say, hey, you know, even if you're not hiring right now, hey, we just want to come in and we want to provide a presentation or a panel or do a roundtable where we can talk to people about our sector and the work that exists in this sector.
Great. Yeah, I think the more ways that we can collectively get the word out of how much demand is coming in the coming years in this sector, the more it'll help everyone. Myrna, I see you have your hand up if you want to unmute yourself.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Actually, I wanted to talk from the other side of the process. I used to be a newcomer to Canada like around 12 years ago. And I realized that for me, there was a problem establishing trust in my skills from the employer's side. I was already a holder of 2 university degrees, and I was asked on so many interviews, during so many interviews, whether I actually know how to work a computer. So I was really surprised to find that actually when I came here, people would think that I don't know how to be on a computer, even though I'm a university graduate. I realized personally that it would really help employers when I would get accreditations from certain professional organizations in Canada. So I don't know, Sienna, from your end, do you think that would be something that employers should also address in terms of how we can establish trust in the applicants' skills, and also whether it would help if these applicants have Canadian accreditations? Thank you.
Thanks so much. That is such an important question. And through our employer engagement project, and we've been doing consultations with, that I mentioned, we've been doing consultations with employers. I will admit that comes up a lot. There is, as I mentioned, there is an assumption that Canadian education surpasses any other education. And there is also a fear which is rooted in ignorance, that the skill sets that folks have on their resumes, or that the education or experience that you have does not equate to Canadian education or experience. So we are doing a few different things to kind of combat that. So one of the biggest things is providing, that education and understanding. And there are some organizations that are working on that work within the area of foreign credentials to help employers understand what those credentials actually mean. But I think education and awareness is the most important piece. And so one of the projects, and we don't have anything tangible yet, but something that we've been exploring, my team has been exploring, is, how could we create a sort of a resource tool that employers could easily grab to help them understand those credentials. So there's a bit of a culture shift, some systems change shift that has to happen in terms of kind of reducing that bias. But I think if we're able to create resources and tools for employers, then that will really, really help with that. But I know that your experience is not unique. And so another one of the reasons that we're trying to sort of pilot and test out this coaching piece of the employer engagement project is so that when employers have questions like that, they can just reach out to us and ask, rather than saying, oh, you know what, I don't know what this school is, I'm not even going to bother with this candidate. And so I also think, because we know because we know the immigrant population is going to continue to increase, having someone on panels, on hiring panels, who can speak to that perspective similar to yours is going to become increasingly important. And we very much encourage employers to do that. And so we're very lucky to be part of the national IEC network. And so we get the opportunity to connect with, Immigration Citizenship Canada and kind of provide this insight. So we are definitely working on it. And I'm definitely going to bring this conversation back to the national network too, to see how we can kind of expand it past sort of Southwestern Ontario and consider what we can do in the other provinces as well.
Perfect. Thank you, Sienna. We have time for just one other question, if there are any. So if just want to open it up to the group, if anyone has any past experiences they want to share or best practices that they found worked well for them, feel free to do so.
Yeah, thank you for the great presentation, Sienna. I just had one quick question. You mentioned about in the slide about the evaluating experience of the youth. So what are some tips or ways in which an employer can do that, just so that they're being fair and getting the right out of it? So
That's a great question. So one of the things that I always say to people is don't assume that just because somebody hasn't done something before that they can't do that. So recognizing that especially young people, and if you consider young people who are immigrating or are coming as refugees, the resilience there is mind-blowing. So for someone to be able to tackle those challenges and barriers, you know, their ability to learn and adjust and you know, it's extremely high. So I think that's something important for employers to consider. Beyond that, in terms of evaluating experience, what I would encourage folks to do is, again, don't assume you know based on the resume. So give folks an opportunity to either showcase their skills, either through sort of tasks, or mini projects and things like that. Again, not sort of ambushing folks in an interview process, but maybe part of your interview process is giving them a scenario or giving them a small project and seeing how they would plan it. Or it's very dependent on what the role is. But you know, think about, you know, what is it that I actually want this person to do in this role, and is there a way for me to actually give them a chance to demonstrate it? When you consider language barriers as well, this is such a great way to be able to sort of evaluate those skills, because sometimes interviews are scary. We know that, and interviews when you're young are scary, and then you layer in language barriers, and you know, it can be really challenging. So if you give people an opportunity on their own time to put together, to show what they can do, that gives them an opportunity to really sort of, you know, compete for that job in a fair way.
Excellent. Thank you, Sienna, and thank you for all the questions. Thanks, Sienna, so much for your great presentation. I think there were a lot of great takeaways and tips that our employers can use in their practices.
Thanks so much for having me.
Growing future forest and conservation leaders.